Hey, everybody, and welcome to the show. This is Liz joining you as usual from Central Virginia and the unceded ancestral lands of the Monacan Nation. And I am so glad that you are here today. And hey, I wanted to make a comment, explanation about this land acknowledgement, since if you've been listening for a while, you probably heard me say this at the beginning of a lot of these shows, but I don't really tell you why I'm doing this. Um, so the purpose of the land acknowledgement, as I understand it, is to honor the original inhabitants of the land. But for me, it also feels important to acknowledge here on the show out loud that my people weren't on the land first. I wasn't here where I am first. That there were original inhabitants on this land dating back 10,000 years, maybe more, and that they were forced off this land by my own ancestral people. And I also do it in part because I want you to think about the land that you're on that's supporting you right now in this moment, too. Who was there before you? I always put in the show notes how you can find whose indigenous lands you might be on. And I think that's a really good step. But, I would also be curious what else you can learn. For example, can you find out more about the history of the people that were there first? And can you support them in some way? I know there are indigenous land trusts in different parts of the United States, like California and Massachusetts. There might be more. Can you help them by learning about their work or by giving to them financially? And if you can't do that, can you even just spread the word that they exist? So just consider this land acknowledgement that I do an invitation to you to explore a little bit more about where you are. And you can always check the show notes if you want to find out whose land you're on. Okay. And with that, I also have to give a quick plug for my book at the beginning of every episode. So here it is. It's funny, I write notes and I don't know why I typed this out because I know what I'm going to say. But, anyways, instead of writing my book, I put my boo, home to her, my book, home to her, walking the transformative path of the sacred feminine is out in the world and ready for you to read it if it would be in your joy to do so. My publisher is Womancraft Publishing, so amazing woman-owned business. So if you do want to read it, I would encourage you to consider buying it directly from them. And if you have read it and you liked it, please leave me a favorable review on Amazon or Goodreads if that would be in your joy too. I love hearing your feedback, and your reviews help other people find this work. And the same is true for this podcast. If you like it, please consider leaving it a review on iTunes or wherever you listen to your podcast. Your reviews really do make a difference, and I am so grateful for each one of them. All right, with that, let's get on with the show, shall we? So I guess it's kind of fitting that I wanted to give a little bit more context about the land acknowledgement today, because on this episode, we're going to be diving into the topic of our relationship with land and how this relates to the sacred feminine. And my guest today is a friend. She's someone I admire deeply and someone I've learned a lot from about what it means to consider yourself a steward of land and the responsibility that comes with that. She's also one of the best connectors and community builders I know, which also feels super relevant to my own exploration of the sacred feminine, especially as we all collectively work to imagine systems that will nurture all of life and value all contributions. And so with that, let me introduce her to you now. Belinda Liu is a nature-inspired visionary, sacred land steward, and community builder. She creates beautiful products, spaces, and experiences that bring people back home to themselves. Home to themselves, home to her, home to us. I love it. Her superpowers are shining a light on people's strengths, bringing them out in the world, and creating life-changing tools and experiences for deep growth. She is a co-founder of Gratitude Blooming, a movement to explore the deep connections between nature and culture, as well as how to create a more beautiful world through art, gratitude, and self-inquiry. She's also the co-founder of the Hestia Retreat Center, located near majestic Mount Shasta in Northern California, a 10-acre retreat center intentionally designed to support rejuvenation, healing, and transformation. She's also a level 3 Reiki healer of people, land, and spaces, and she is joining us today from her office in Mount Shasta, California. Belinda, thank you so much for being with me today.
Liz, you did such a great job explaining who I am. I think the show is over. It's done. That's it.
Uh,
That's it.
Not a chance. No, 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 no. There's way too much that we have to talk about. I do like to tell guests though, that's one of my favorite things is writing like just their bio. I mean, you give me information, right? So I know what to say, but then
Hmm.
um I like reflecting people's goodness back to them. I think we should all get that from time to time, like the good things we're doing in the world. And you're certainly doing a lot. So,
Thank you for that gift.
mhm. Well, I like to start the show always in the same place. And, so Belinda and I have known each other for a while. And I realized as I was thinking about the questions for this, I don't know the answer to this question. So I am excited. My listeners and I are going to learn together. But the first question I always, like to ask people is for them to share a little bit about their spiritual background. And I do that because it's kind of an entryway into talking about this divine feminine. Did you get any of that in your background or not? And also, I think it's an interesting inquiry to think about, were there things that were helpful that you pulled through, or was it kind of like, I got nothing and I had to start over? So, with that, I would love to hear just a little bit about what your spiritual background was like growing up.
Hmm, that's a beautiful question. And I have to say, I can't wait to hear for myself what emerges just sitting with that. So I'm originally from Taiwan. That is my homeland. And I moved to the US when I was 5. And my cultural background is really Buddhist. And, growing up in Taiwan, you would always see, ancestral altars everywhere in restaurants. Everybody's house had one on the wall. We always lit incense for our ancestors. And it felt very much like part of the culture, just because family was like center and core to our way of living. And I don't know if I would associate that with spirituality per se,
Mm,
especially in the first like 3 decades of my life. I didn't really grow up with a particular spiritual direction. I think especially when we immigrated to the United States, it was just so much about understanding the physical world and the culture of the physical world that was so different from what I had, grown up with in Taiwan. And I think looking back, what I would say is um, I started to develop a relationship with nature. I think through my mother. She was always this, avid gardener. There was always the beautiful flowers and plants in the house. And I think in my adult life, I started to go to nature, almost instinctively, um, when I needed to get out of my head or get out of myself. And I think what I've realized is it's these moments of being with a mountain, being with the trees, being with the plants that you start to realize, wow, there's so much more to life than the physical reality that we're in the moment. And I think where it ties back to my cultural heritage is I think that has a lot to do with my female line.
mm,
Um, so I'm really grateful to my ancestors for, imparting that in my blood almost. So much so that I can't even consciously like explain it till now that it's just such a part of me. My mother's side of the family has always been of the land. They've always been, farmers, fishermen, gardeners, artists who capture nature. So it's interesting that I'm now seeing how I'm a product of that lineage without even like trying. It's just like it's
mhm,
just happening
mhm.
naturally.
Wow. That makes so much sense knowing, and we'll talk about all this, but knowing what I know about you with your work with the land and your work with nature through gratitude blooming and all that, that's super cool. Um, Tell me about, was there a point in time when you became aware of this idea that I refer to as the sacred feminine? And we can talk about your language too, if that works for you or not. But was there a particular moment in time when you began to think about an aspect of divinity or your spiritual path, like being connected to this idea of the sacred feminine?
I if you had asked me 10 years ago or 15 years ago about this question, I probably wouldn't be able to unpack it in this particular way. But in this moment now, what I've realized is, what is the feminine? The feminine is the source of life. The feminine is this nurturing energy that, we may feel from our mothers or grandmothers, or someone who's just really kind of loving us from the heart. Um, for me, I think I felt that really strongly when I was in college. I studied abroad in South India. And then over the summer, I went to Nepal. And I remember climbing these huge mountains and just feeling really held by them. And I think that was maybe the first time I really understood the sacred feminine in the magnitude that it was like, wow, there is this larger body of land that is holding us all on this planet. And then there's this really kind of divine energy that you can't really explain with logic, but you can feel it in your heart when you're there. That like, something else is holding us, something else is guiding us, something else is present with us. So I think of that as like, the divine mother, the highest form of the feminine that's present, holding space for all of us on this planet and this universe. And it's been interesting to reclaim that within myself, because professionally, every single professional personality work assessment I've ever taken, I've been hyper masculine, overachiever, planner, strategist, things like that. I remember taking the Gallup strengths test in one of my nonprofit jobs, and I was like, whoa, there's a lot of doing in this energy. And it took several years of realizing how that didn't really serve me, to work and effort so much, and that I needed to bring that nurturing back, and learning from other people that had that quality, and realizing actually that's in me too, but it's been so quiet and dormant for so long.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious if you could say more about that evolution too, because I know that you're, um, even when you and I met, we actually met when we were both doing wildly different things. If you guys have listened to the show for a while, you know that I've referenced this business career that I had. And Belinda and my first real interaction was we had a mastermind group where we were working on our collective our businesses together with another friend, trying to support each other. I think much more in the way in which I operate now, like really I use the word spiritual, and I'm using that as a catch-all for intentional, perhaps, like, but so I think our mastermind was kind of headed towards perhaps where we are now, but it was still very rooted. We were rooted in the business world. So I'm wondering if you could talk about that evolution for you that you referenced, of that. Um, I'm translating it as like being, instead of just doing, like being a doer, but also like being present and being held. Like what was that like for you over those several years?
Yeah, and I would say that, coming from an immigrant background where, you're comfortably middle class in the country that you're from, and then you come to the United States and you're basically the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder. My parents came for higher education and degrees. But that even just that reality puts you in a perspective of like, you've got to make it worth those sacrifices. So I think that has been in the background of my upbringing, and
Yeah.
then that plus this desire to succeed in the world in whatever way that meant. And for me, it's always been more social change driven. I went into a degree in career and education in my first 10 years of working. As I was a classroom teacher, I worked in nonprofit leadership, really trying to support teachers and leaders to do the tough work of really doing right by students. And I was working in these very diverse environments with a lot of immigrants, a lot of English learners, and so it felt like that mission was like so big that like if I didn't wake up every day, 150% in my tank and just doing the work, that I was failing other people whose lives, were at stake. It felt that big at the time,
Mm.
my 20s. And then after 4 years of like working like that, I started getting really tired, and I think I started to ask questions. And that's kind of the late 20s, early 30s, the Saturn returns time, when
Yeah.
we all in our cycles start to wonder, like, am I really on the right track? Like, is this as good as it gets? That's like the first like small like midlife crisis that we experience. And I just realized I couldn't keep going like that anymore. And I actually met a leader who was in her 60s. She was a queer Jewish woman who grew up in South Africa, and she was so in touch with her spirituality. And at that time, I started to understand what spirituality really meant, because I was a little bit turned off by religion. I was just like not into that institution, but I was really drawn to this like 60-year-old woman who just like showed up in our nonprofit office and would have us like talk about like animal totems. and
Mm.
and she was so comfortable showing up like that, that I realized that like there could be another way. And I
Mm.
think that was the beginning of reclaiming that part of myself, allowing that to show up in the work environment, which is like, I think, super edgy when you're going through this identity shift.
Oh yeah, totally. Um, well, and I want to kind of talk about where you are now too. So well, let's say, so I just want to fill in the gaps there. So you left, you went from that environment. Do you feel like it was sort of like a progression for you from, I don't know, how would you describe it, as an undoing, as a
I would
revealing,
say
or?
I would say it was like it felt like a series of initiations.
Mm.
Like, in your 20s, you have to kind of go through the more traditional pathway sometimes, because that's already there, that's set. You can see what that path is. There's even a roadmap there, right?
Yeah.
And then at some point, it's like, okay, I don't think I want to work like that. And so for me, and I'm an Aquarius, so I'm like, once something doesn't work, I kind of like take the leap, and I go to the unknown, and I let things happen. And what happened was I ended up taking a consulting role, and I was like, how do I still have time to really explore, like, what is it that I really want to do, but also, not worry about paying the bills. So I ended up doing education consulting work. And then on the other side, I was really investing in, well, what is my work? And so the first iteration of that was doing a wellness app that helped people reflect on their, the things that they care about, their physical well-being, their social well-being, all these things. And that was very tied to what I was doing in my nonprofit work, was helping, teachers reflect on their practice. And realizing that what I wanted to do also needed to involve community, because what I started to see was personal growth. You can't do that in a cave by yourself, seeing only yourself. I think monks can do that really well. But if you're a person that's in the world, that has a mission to be in the world, you have to be in relationship. And so I evolved, Liz, this was the time that we met. I evolved the wellness app into a group learning platform online, where we all, we did these like online challenges, exploring creativity and purpose and empathy and kindness and all these things. Um, and and that was powerful to learn and grow with other people and be mirrors for each other. Um, and I think along the way, learning too, just like, how do I want to spend my time? When do I feel energized? When do I feel depleted? I feel like that was the time in our lives when we were starting to explore that as we were creating and birthing these big things.
Mm-hmm.
Is it was also like caring about like, well, how does that feel for me
Yep.
to do these things?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I don't, this isn't really about me, but I do want to just interject this for the listeners because and I just reflect to you, Belinda, that so when we met, we actually met at like this event called Wisdom at Work, and this was very it was close to well, okay, so it was not long after I had kind of figured out like, aha, I think I'm here to explore this thing that I'm calling the sacred feminine, and I don't know what it is, but I still own a consulting firm and I still have a lot of employees and clients and I've got whoa, and I've got two kids now, one that's like a very little baby and the other's a toddler. And what am I going to do? I've got to keep going. And so so my solution at the time, rather than try to get out of that world, because I wasn't ready to do that yet, was to try and start networking with people who were bringing this more intentional kind of thing to work. And so that's how I ended up at this event. And fortunately, I lived in the Bay Area of California where people were asking these questions at the time. It was a perfect place to be. And I just remember meeting you and some other people that, we are still all a part of each other's lives now, years later. And it was just such a mind blowing thing that there were people um, who wanted to explore these things like how do we show up at work and how do we support each other in the best ways and lift each other up, and not just for the service of the product and the commerce, but because we care about each other and because we are better when we are doing that and when we are showing up as our full selves. It was just it was like a radical idea to me, just radical and like the greatest thing I'd ever seen. And then, of course, it also inspired me. I don't want to do this anymore. I want to go do more of that and not in a business context, which here I am now. Um, but anyways, well, and then I think for you, the land came calling for you, did it not?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I feel like, Liz, we started asking these big questions of like, what, like, does work have to be like this?
Yeah.
Like, does it have to feel this way? Do I have to shut a part of myself off to be able to do these things? And I think, we both took the next step of being self-employed. So we had more freedom in some ways. And I think when you start asking those big questions, it uncovers even more questions and it doesn't necessarily get easier. So what happened with me was I realized I was doing all these things for my passion and my love and my desire to see change in the world. And I was kind of financing it with my other business, which was the education consulting work. And at one point I was just like, I don't think I can sustain these two buckets of things. Like I was still kind of, like Superman, like one life, in one way and another life in another way. And finally, I was like, I've got to surrender. Like if I'm meant to continue to do this type of work, there has to be some opportunity that makes it clear that I'm meant to do it. So it was this real surrender moment where I was like, I need something financially to support this work that I'm doing that's beyond what I'm, supporting for myself in this personal growth work. And I actually met someone who I had met doing a Fulbright in China. And she was like, I know this friend and there's this program in Santiago, Chile, for entrepreneurs all over the world. You can spend 7 months there incubating a business idea. And I thought, wow, if I'm meant to continue with this work, then maybe this is the opportunity. So I literally met with the person and he got all this good ideas about the program. I went online. I'm like, what's the deadline? It was like 2 days from the day that I had first heard about it, scrambled to get all the application materials together. And then just waited. And I remember like a couple months later, I got this email. It's like, congratulations, now you're going to spend 7 months in Chile. And it felt like this sign of like, okay, keep on going. Like there's something here for you. It's hard right now, but just take that next step. And what happened was that time in Chile was kind of a reset. It was just like an opportunity to kind of exhale, stop hustling to like make enough money to pay the bills, to pay for this business, and just to focus on what it is that I wanted to create. And when I got back to California, one of the things I noticed was how hard it was to be in the city, in the Bay Area again. And I noticed that to kind of balance myself, I would go to nature like every single weekend. I would go to the trees to help ground myself. And and the more that I found myself in nature, the more that I craved more of that time. And I think it goes back to that sacred feminine. When you're in this vulnerable place of transition in your life, you need to be held by something larger. And a friend of mine mentioned, have you heard of this place called Mount Shasta? It's actually the root energy, the root chakra of the earth. If you need to be held by the divine mother, if you need to be held by the earth, you need to go there to get grounded. And so I, on a whim, went there with a friend and spent 7 days on this little canyon. There was like a mineral bathhouse and some like rustic cabins. And that was the major turning point of my journey, I would say, because I started to really feel this invitation from the land in this little canyon. And there happened to be this A-frame house with a bridge and a creek. There was a big for sale sign, and then there was a big no trespassing sign. And I remember every time we would drive by the house, I would be like, let's stop, let's take a break, let's see if anyone's there. And towards the end, we realized no one was living there. And we stepped foot on the land. And the first time my feet planted on that ground and touched the soil and felt the trees, I felt like I was coming home to myself. And I felt invited by the land to be there. And I've never felt that before in that way.
It's beautiful. And that land, of course, became Hestia, your retreat center, which you now have had for many years. I wonder if you could tell us why you chose the name Hestia. I'm guessing for some of my listeners, that name may sound familiar for you, but if not, yeah.
Well, sometimes the naming can be really complex, and you just have to spend so much time trying to figure out what the name is. But for me, was interesting was after setting foot on the land for the first time, I literally went back every single month. And this is like a 4.5-hour drive from the Bay Area. So it's not a short trip. And every single month I would go back, I would bring different people. I brought my partner, Peter, for the second month. The third month, I brought the friend that told me about Mount Shasta being this root chakra of the earth. And she was like, well, let's set an intention for this weekend. Let's pick some goddess cards to see if there's any, guides for us. And I picked Hestia, the Greek goddess of the flame, the family, the community, the hearth. And I remember reading about what she represented. And immediately it was like, oh, this is the land speaking to me and saying, this is what the intention of the land is. Are you up for this challenge or this invitation? And I feel like once I got that message from the goddess, I stopped doubting that I was supposed to be there to steward the land and be in relationship with the land. And literally, by month 5, we were had put an offer in and closed on the place, and and started to celebrate and to start listening to what the land wanted for us.
Yeah. And I just, having watched you do that for the last several years now, I wonder if you can, I feel like this is a nice entry point to this idea of land stewardship. And I just love that the invitation to the land came from the goddess, how appropriate, and especially tying back into everything you said about when you were younger and feeling held by the land, and, that kind of mother energy, just how appropriate that it was a goddess that invited you into that space. And so I wonder, because one of the things I've witnessed you do is Anybody can buy a piece of property and be like, I'm going to make this a healing center. Not everybody, but you know what I mean? Like, you can, but there's something different to me, I think, when you say the words land steward, right? Like that's it. That's different than saying I own this land and I therefore can do with it whatever I want. So maybe you could just talk a little bit about the idea of land stewardship, what that means, and also if that has evolved for you in your last several years of playing this role.
Yeah, I think what was really beautiful about this experience started in 2014, so it's now been 8 years, was the place of innocence that I was coming from. I think it really was this place of, I don't know what's going to happen. This feels crazy, but I still am going to take this leap because it's such a strong yes in my body. And initially we thought it was just this strong desire to just be in nature, like, more. And we had no idea what was going to come from that. But one of the things that was very clear from the beginning was just it's deep listening. And so what I would do is just walk the land every time I was there, and I would just listen and notice, what the land was speaking to me. And initially it was just about observation. It was just, can you come back every time and see what's here and be aware of seasons and change? And the creek that was flowing in front of the land was always communicating this message of, like, can you be in flow? Can you surrender like me? And there wasn't much doing, like, initially. It was just more watching and seeing, what would happen if we brought friends here. I remember, Liz, when you came for the first time, and one of the things that I saw was there wasn't much that I needed to do or to orchestrate or to create or to manage or to facilitate even. It was just allowing the land to connect with each person. And over time, what I saw was, wow, like, huge insights can come for people when they just have that sacred space to be with themselves and to listen and to have the Divine Mother speak directly to them. And after 4 years, more and more people would come, and we were hosting people in our A-frame house. And I noticed the living room started to get a little cramped, and it felt like at that point, it was like a critical threshold of, like, what are you going to do now? And I remember walking the land one day and just feeling into it, and starting to see a vision for, oh, there could be more space for people to be here. And that was my divine and sacred responsibility, was to create that space. And it wasn't until that moment that I got an invitation to do that. And before, it almost felt like, I needed to just stay in my lane and take care of what was already there. But then, 4 years in, it was like, okay, now is the time. And I'm so grateful that we waited for that divine time to happen before, adding anything else to the land.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the words that are coming to mind for me are relationship building, and how I think that, I don't know if you would say the same thing, Belinda, but I know for me, I could think about, well, it takes time to build relationship with people, right? You just meet somebody once. And sometimes we have that like immediate connection of like, yes, I have known you somewhere before, and we can go right there to the depth. But sometimes it takes time to build that trust. But I don't know that people always think about that in terms of relationship with land. And I know that's something that's been driven home for me where I live now in Virginia. Like, my first impression when I walked on this land was that it had been a really long time since anyone, and particularly a white person, had actually stopped and noticed the land and had just been with it. So there was the thing that I sensed coming from the land, whether or not I'm projecting on it or not, was a hesitation of like, wait a minute, we don't know each other yet. Why don't you just take your time? sit down a little bit and see what's here, and then we can move into relationship. And I would say that took, I've been here 2 years now, and I mean the first full year, I would say I felt hesitancy from the land. Um, and so what I love, what you're talking about, is that listening to the land is, to me, it implies that there is a sacred agreement. There is a sacred relationship between you and the land. It is a living thing, full of living things. Everything's alive. And that we have to honor that relationship before we really do anything. I mean, does that feel right to you?
Yes. And how do we pay attention and learn that language, right? Because we're not speaking in the way that Liz, you and I are speaking. It's a subtle I feel like it's primordial language
Yeah.
where, and I had to learn it. I had to learn it just through being so present, like when I would walk the land, to ask what does it want of me, at each point. um it was a very subtle kind of conversation where, at times, if it was a yes or an openness, I would feel this kind of expansion in my body. And at times, other times it felt like there was a more contracted feeling. And there were very specific questions I would ask. There was this shack that was already on the land by the creek, kind of down the path from our house. And I had always dreamed of having a yurt. I love round spaces. I love the circular symbol. And at one point I was like, maybe we should just put a yurt here. And I remember going to the cabin and the shack and asking, do you want to be a circular structure? Can we put a yurt here? And every time I would go, I would just feel this contraction in my body. And that almost felt like a no, energetic no from the land. And after a while, I was like, okay, let me know, give me a sign, let me know what I should do, or what you want, how you want the space to be. And one day I walked over and I got this word resurrection. And I was like, oh, this shack wants to be a cabin like it was, back, years ago. And so I do think that there is this conversation that can happen, but it's very subtle. It's nonverbal. And in this day and age of, we talk a lot about consent, right? Like, how often do we ask the land for consent because we don't know how to communicate? And so that has been a big part of my awareness, and also what it means to be a land steward is the deep presence, the deep listening, and the asking for consent. When an idea emerges, it's like, is it because I really want this, because I have this vision that I'm really attached to, or is it because this is what the land is wanting of me? And that's a really hard, and you oftentimes also have to rely on other people to check, like, am I calibrating correctly with what the land is wanting? And I think that's the other part is, building a community of people that are speaking that language with the land, and that you can kind of check in with. And I feel like we did that a lot, Liz, with the women's circles that we were a part of on the land.
Mm-hmm. Oh, definitely. Yeah, so much comes up for me as you're talking about that. And one question I have for you is, was it hard for you to trust those answers initially? Like, you know what I mean? Was there doubt that, am I actually in communication with the land here, or am I, telling myself stories, or was it just a natural? Because I think there's a lot of times, if we don't have that in our lives, we tend to doubt that communication, right? Or we question ourselves, or is this real? And so I'm curious if you had any of that, at least at the outset.
I think I was in such a ripe and open time of my life. I was, very much still in kind of a transitional point. I think I was more open to receiving new ways. And I think there were points where I was like, am I, am I crazy for listening like this, or am I making this stuff up? And what would happen is I would just say to myself, well, if this keeps coming back over and over again, then I need to trust that this is what it is. And I think that became kind of my rule of thumb is, if it's, if this is coming into my mind or my consciousness like once and then it goes away, maybe that's not so relevant. But if I keep getting these different signs, and I feel like it was like a little bit of a scavenger hunt, like following these like cosmic breadcrumbs of, you know, of insight and clues for what to do next. And it's really interesting when I started to open myself up to that, they would show up pretty consistently. So yeah, there was a little bit of the doubting, but then it was also like, this is coming back again. Like, why is that? And almost trying to calm the mind a little bit around that, like trying to understand and just accepting, opening, receiving, which is, so much of the sacred feminine.
Oh, totally. And I'm actually I'm remembering too something you said to me. We were in Oakland, in the Bay Area, and I remember telling you of like, oh my gosh, I feel like I have to sit in meditation for like 30, 45 minutes to just like get quiet to, to hear the inner guidance. And I remember you just saying, well, or maybe you need to be somewhere else. Maybe you need to be in nature. Maybe it doesn't have to be so hard. I was like, oh yeah, because people think of. I thought of the Bay Area as a very progressive place, and ideas wise, it absolutely is. But it's just, you're talking about city energy, just like anywhere else. There's a lot of cerebral, a lot of the head kind of stuff going on, and there's a lot of noise. There's a lot of noise, literal noise, and head noise, and so I think that maybe it gets easier. I know that's what I've experienced at your place. That it gets easier to listen to that when you're in nature too. You can, it's still subtle, but the voice gets louder. Yeah.
Because the clutter isn't as there as much. That's such a good reminder of that time. Like I think, when we're in places where there's a pretty strong culture that's established, it's hard to kind of break free from that. And I think looking back now, I realized I was wayfinding to find a new way of living for myself, a new way of creating, by being in nature more and less in, the culture of the Bay Area, which is very much, 10x growth kind of energy, right? And like,
Yes.
and at the time, I was still trying to figure out, well, what is this personal growth web application supposed to be like? And I would go to the land to really work through some things. And what was crazy, or maybe not so crazy, was what I realized being on the land and doing that kind of work was how out of alignment I was in some ways working with technology, because in many ways, I think my work is meant to be physical, tangible, visual, less, online. And so it was interesting because it led to this realization, like, I don't think I'm meant to be creating something of using technology as a tool. That's just not my essence. And going to the land and being so physical and so tactile helped me realize that. And it just was such clarity. Like, if you're supposed to create a new way of being and even creating in a new kind of way of creating, you have to get out of the old ways to be able to feel a new way, feel your way through a new way. Because it's like still very uncertain what that new way is.
Yes, totally. I also just wanted to name this too, as you were describing, listening to the land. And when I was doing the research for my book, there was a practice in Northern Europe, probably not just Northern Europe. I'd have to go back to my notes now. But a practice called sitting out, where you would just go, the women, the witches would go and just sit. they would just go sit on the land and communicate with the land. They would listen, and they would share, they would take their questions. Um, and of course, there was a whole thing where, the Catholic Church really went bonkers, like even telling people they couldn't, that, you're not allowed to stare into a pool of water because you might be getting spiritual answers that they want you to get within the church. This is a true thing. Um, but it also makes me think about what you were saying in the beginning about your ancestral line. Like, right? I think these indigenous practices that people have are unique to their place, and they also have a through line. And so it makes me wonder about your own ancestral people and the relationships that they might have had with the land. I don't know if the research actually exists, or what, if there were people in what we now know as Taiwan who were sitting out, but I would imagine that there were, whatever they called it and whatever that practice was.
Yeah, I mean, Taiwan is 2/3 mountainous, and we have a lot of indigenous tribes in Taiwan, which is, something that a lot of people probably don't know. And and I have to imagine that all of our ancestors, because of our survival, basic survival needs, we were looking to nature to understand, how are we going to feed ourselves this next season, and also looking at the stars to understand what was happening with time. And I would say, if you had asked me like 15 years ago or 10, what I would be doing, I would not have expected that I'd be talking to you about being a land steward, and nature being the medium and the like core of my work. But I think it is this almost a sacred responsibility that I feel now. Also being able to trace it back to my maternal line, that, this is something that wants to be brought back into modern life. But let's not just replicate what our ancestors did. Let's figure out what makes sense for this time. And I remember
Yeah.
there being a spot on the land that, Liz, you and I would go to. It's now the heart chakra of our land, and we called it the ancestral grove. There's a big circular grove of trees, and that would be another place that I would sit and just feel and connect with the ancestral wisdom, and ask for guidance. And it's just interesting how sometimes just doing that simple act of like stopping and being and noticing can create the massive insights that then help us with whatever it is that we're struggling with. Like, I remember, when I would go through that uncertainty in the cities, I would just navigate it by trying to strategize or plan even more. Like that was my
Yes.
like mechanism. And I was like,
Oh my
wait,
God.
there could be another way.
Totally. Totally. Well, and now I would love to hear you just talk too. So yeah, I know the story of Hestia because I've been there. So I know that resurrection happened. The cabin was there, and then over time, other structures have been added, right? And I assume that was also part of that listening process. But I wondered if you could talk a little bit too about some of the other elements that have made those possible. Like you talked about community, but I've also seen you with Hestia really working at like this forefront of what I think of as like this paradigm shift, where how are we going to um, we can all sit around and talk all we want about cultures of domination and hierarchy and how profit rules all, but what does it actually mean to try and live your life? It's shifting that paradigm. And I feel like in the growth, this gradual and thoughtful expansion of Hestia, I've also seen you kind of working with that paradigm shift. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I love that we're in this day and age where people are returning back to the land. Like, so many people are wanting to be land stewards and live more in nature. And it definitely is powerful and beautiful. And it's also a lot less romantic than like what I see on Instagram feeds. I'm like, oh my God, it is so much work in different kinds of ways. I think in the beginning, we were experimenting with urban and city living, or urban and rural living, kind of going back and forth. So for the first 4 years, it was just, how do we take care of the land as it is, and feel the subtle shifts and more dramatic shifts of like living across these very different realities. And it was very like polar opposite kind of feelings. Um, and renting the house as a way to financially support what we were doing, and just doing it that way, like, the vacation rental models that you kind of see right now. And then over the years, starting in 2018, I really felt like this shift in wanting to live more on the land and trying to unpack, what that meant. And I think the more time that we spent there, we started to see what was possible. And, initially, also holding space for large retreats, and that being kind of one financial model for, supporting the land. And I felt like at that time, it was like, you're supposed to just learn from working with these large groups and seeing how does the land respond. It was very much like a science experiment in some ways. And what I saw over time was that there was this depth, that if we could get to this depth of people that could spend more time there, or have the land be the center of their experience, more transformation, more possibilities for what they could receive was greater. And it also was more life-giving for the land, not for it to just be lodging, but for it to be a place that was seen and honored, and people would come and for that. So almost it became like this living temple space that you could be with the sacred, but you could also sleep with the sacred, and you could eat with the sacred. And so back in 2019, we started to like more formally establish ourselves on the land, which meant that we needed to create more spaces and more structures. And when COVID hit, we were able to get some, government relief funds to build a 20-foot yurt. And prior to that, in 2018, my partner Peter and I had our sacred union. And instead of having like a registry, we had friends and family just contribute to a fund for this yurt that we were all going to be in for the actual sacred union. And then we had another community member who received a lot of healing from being on the land for many years, who just donated a 22-foot Mongolian yurt. And so it's just interesting how that just kind of started to happen. And I think it was the ethos of Hestia, of the community, of the hearth. And then at one point, I really started to see how, as more people were spending longer time on the land, how it could be a place for creativity, for birthing new paradigms and visions. It was incredible to watch people have a light bulb moment and then go off and create something, after they, left the land. And, but, there was this challenge of financing of, if we wanted to create a couple more yurts, so there could be these residencies, how could we do it? And there were a couple moments in our path where there were community members who were like, if you ever wanted us to build something here, or we'd love to spend more time here, please let us know. And so we were like, well, what would it take to finance 3 yurts through the community? And I have to say, that was a really edgy thing to, it's hard to ask people for money in whatever form.
Oh yeah.
And we had just built the 20-foot yurt and so we kind of had an idea of how much it would cost. And so we started to just imagine, well, what would make it exciting for the people if we were to ask them to finance this? Instead of relying on a bank, what if we relied on our community? And we came up with a proposal of, it was about $30,000 that it took to build the 20-foot yurt. What if we could have a 5-year partnership? And People would receive, half of the profits every year for 5 years, and then they would be able to spend up to 4 months on the land, because that was really the desire that we were hearing, was like people wanted to have more time with the land. And so because of that, so we got, 3 different groups to invest in those 3 yurts. And because of that, we were able to, over the winter, our rest period on the land, have 4-month residents, or people that would, stay longer to really incubate over the winter their visions. But yeah, it wouldn't have been possible without the community support, because this is also kind of literally out of the box, right? Like most banks are not going to finance these like non-permanent structures. It's not
No.
a house, and so we really kind of were pushed to think differently about how to even do that.
Mm. Yeah. I mean, the word that just keeps coming up for me as you're talking, 2 words, is just, okay, 3 words. It's just like radical faith or trust. I could just substitute faith or trust, and that is that feels like a lesson for me, it's been a lesson of the feminine, that being held by the land. Um, and also, it's just really, it's hard, right? Like because it's so counter to the way we tend to work. Like we tend to, okay, I won't say we, I'll say I, but the way I tend to work, which is like, well, let me just work out just like you were referencing, let me just work out my strategic plan. This is what I want to happen. So now I'm going to write down all the steps and the way it's going to get there. And I'm going to put a timeline on it. Because if I don't put a timeline on it, it's not going to get done, and this feels like, as you're talking about it, like it requires this radical trust that a different vision can come in, that it's maybe it comes in its own time. And then at the same time, the way you're talking about the relationship with the land, there's like a softness. When I say radical trust, that feels very edgy. But then when I think about that being held by the land, there's like a softness that comes in, which is like, of course, I don't know if I'm saying that right, but of course you can trust in this. You can trust in the land. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think the land is probably the most tangible form of the divine that we have in front of us, that we can see and touch and feel. And if I were to just orchestrate my life from what I know, there's no way this vision could have happened. There was no way that I was going to be like, oh, I'm going to live 4.5 hours away in some rural place that have no idea about, and then have to build community from here. And I mean, it just would have sounded very inconvenient. It would have been
Mhm.
wild. I mean, I thought I was going to be building community in the Bay Area and living in the city and going for my hikes in the redwoods on the weekends. And the universe had a different plan. And it was was a much more beautiful, bigger plan than I could have ever imagined, because now that I've seen what's possible, it's creating this ripple effect of like, well, what else is possible, and I think the side story is, I was telling you all, like, I was thinking I was going to work in technology, and this was the way of creating and pushing and accelerating, personal growth, was through this, group learning platform. And even that kind of doing that work in parallel with bringing people to the land, I saw like how much more possibility there was for people to get those insights very quickly, in a short amount of time, just on sacred land, versus, the mental work of being online and doing, and that's also has a lot of value too. It's both are important. It's just more like, what am I here to serve?
Yeah.
And it was interesting because the technology, of all the things that we tried within the technology, the beauty of that was we got to try different modalities, and what I found was gratitude was the entry point that I wanted to serve for groups. And that became what gratitude blooming is now, which is, using the intuition of the plants, and using art as a way to create this new narrative for ourselves, and that being a physical tool for people to connect with nature. And so I think that can take so many different forms. We can live in cities and still remember that sacred relationship. It might be a little bit harder to do at times, but that's also very possible. And I think it's just this opening up of, I surrender to a bigger possibility for my life that then can create so many different pathways that like we cannot plan or strategize for. We just need to be open enough and curious enough to like let it happen. So that, I think that what's been the biggest awakening for me is like, oh, and that's how we're going to create the new world that all of our hearts are yearning for, because we know this old one is not going to stand the test of time and it's just crumbling.
That's so good. Okay, so we're running out of time. There's so much more we could talk about. I want to make sure you reference gratitude blooming quickly. Belinda has created a beautiful set of oracle cards. My family's been using them for years. And that are really about merging this, gratitude and deep self-inquiry with nature and what we see in the world around us. And so I want to make sure to go check this out in the show notes. And she's also hosts a really beautiful podcast that explores the themes that are present in the oracle cards. And I want to make sure all that's in the show notes because I think you guys should check that out. And if you have time, Belinda, I'd love to ask you one more question, which is, and again, like, let's couch this in the language of that radical trust and understanding that this bigger vision can be revealed to you over time. But where is your vision now? Like right now, like what are you seeing is possible at this moment for where you go? I guess with either of those projects or both or whatever, but with the land stewardship, with gratitude blooming, with your work in general in your life.
I think we're in a massive inflection point of humanity where we all are, whether we like it or not, we are all having to be wayfinders in uncertainty and the unknown. And I feel that the most common, simplest way to find our way is through this relationship with nature. That nature is biodiverse. Nature self-corrects. Nature finds harmony and balance in its own way, despite us humans. And so then how can we really tune into nature to understand like the cycles of life? When is it time to step in? When's it time to step back? When's it time to move quickly? When's it time to rest? And so for me, I'm just radically about, well, how do we get as many people as possible in communion with the sacred that is nature? And I think with the Hestia Retreat Center, what I'm seeing is these energy spots on the planet are here to help accelerate our transformation. And so what I'm seeing is a network of 8 sacred sites, locations where community can flow. So not just these ley lines exist already. They're already connected on the earth. It's just like the humans, are we coherent enough to be stewards of these places? And that's really what I imagine is growing an intergenerational community of people all over the world where we can go to these different places to commune with the land in different ways. Like Mount Shasta is beautiful for visioning, clarifying, aligning, grounding. It's like this type of like line energy, up and down and across. I've been traveling to the big island of Hawaii and finding that there is this very expansive energy there, and the land is so fertile. The mangoes just grow and grow and grow. And so how do we work with abundance with discernment? That's a whole totally different kind of energy. Glastonbury, England is such a heart-opening place. So what would it look like if we did our inner work in communion with these different sacred sites and really honoring these points on the planet and also learning how to exchange with each other in different ways as we grow together.
Mm. Mm. It's a beautiful vision. I hold that with you. And I'm excited to hear how that all is going to unfold for you. Um, and I'm just wishing we had more time. I feel like this went really fast. So maybe I'll have to come back. You'll have to come back and give us an update. And yeah, we could. I don't know. We've got a lot of other stuff we could cover.
And I'm excited for you, Liz, to be on our podcast very soon. We'll be talking about the Gratitude Blooming theme of harmony and balance, which is a big one for these
Mhm.
times.
Oh yeah, I know that will be fun. So I'll have to put that out there. I don't tend to talk about it on the show, but you've got to follow me on social media if you want to find out about that stuff. But yeah, and I want to thank you so much for your time, Belinda, and for sharing your insights and your journey. I'm so grateful. I'm so grateful to know you, and I'm grateful that you were willing to share this with listeners too. It's really wonderful.
I'm grateful for the community that you're building, Liz, and so in awe of how it's growing and expanding in the world. And this is such an important focus. Is like, how do we reclaim that sacred feminine so we can be in harmony and balance at this
Totally.
time?
Yeah, such a rich inquiry too. Well, and I want to thank all of you guys for listening as always. If you like the show, you can give it a good review. You can tell your friends about it. You can subscribe. You can do all those things. And I will make sure you know how to find out all about Belinda, all of her. So let me just let you tell people real quick, like social media, where to find you. And I'll put that in the show notes too. But
So for the retreat center, you can find us at hestiamagic.com, HESTIA magic.com. And to get your Gratitude Blooming Oracle cards, go to gratitudeblooming.com.
awesome. Thank you. And thank you all for being here. And until next time, take really good care of yourselves. And I'll talk to you again soon.